crafty friends. Today we're going to talk about the bunny onesie. Why are you being so crazy? In this tutorial, we will be making... What are you doing? Puppies! Oh my gosh. Rhoda, go sit down. In this tutorial, we will be making the body... Oh my god. In this tutorial, we will be making the body onesie, which is a strapless one piece. Head over to the kit and buy this pattern. It is Yaya Han's onesie pattern. Well, I hack this a little bit. Depending on the type of fabric you have, there are different ways to make this. And so I'm showing you the way that I do it. Also, you'll notice in this video, I use giant zip ties. I know, isn't that weird? I'm telling you, if you cannot find the right boning or if you're in a pinch, head to the hardware store and get yourself some gigantic zip ties. They look like this. Oh, sorry, sweetie. All right, let's try this baby on and see how it looks. Ooh la la. To get this pattern started, we will be working from the center out. First, we will be doing the front, then we'll be doing the back, and then we attach them together at the sides. Starting with your center front, run a straight stitch down your main outer fabric, and then you'll be repeating this in the interior lining as well. For my purpose of making this, I will be adding the boning to the interior lining, which is a heavy to medium weight non-stretch cotton, so it can handle boning casings. In this video, I will be showing you how to make one side of the garment. I don't film both sides, it's not necessary, so when I do one side, know that I had paused the camera and did the other side. So with this, I've sped it up, but I've done a straight stitch, opened up the seams, and ran stitching along either side. This is purely decorative. I just like the way it looks. It's not specifically necessary. As you can see, that looks pretty nice. And then you repeat with your interior fabric. When choosing fabric for this, I selected a waxed denim, which is the outer fabric, and for the interior, I use a medium weight non-stretch cotton. I make notches in any curve for help with fit. And again, I'm running that stitch down either side of the seam allowance on the inside. Purely decorative. But you will get used to doing this when you're making your casings for the boning, although you will be flipping both parts of the seam allowance to one side. Moving on to the next piece, which is the middle front. Make sure to match your notches. This will help ensure that you're sewing the right piece to the right side. I think we've all been there where we've sewn the wrong thing together, so this will help you. And again, just sewing a simple straight stitch all the way down, making sure to match my notches and my edges as much as possible. And from here, I will do the same process where I flip the seams open and stitch down either side of them. One quick point of note for those who are using the Yaya Han pattern, there are two versions of the onesie here. There's version A and version B, and the difference is how many pattern pieces, and then the back differences is one is a zipper and one is corset lacing. Whether you're choosing to assemble A or B, the same rules apply here that I'm showing you, unless you're doing the corset lacing, which is a whole different ballgame and we can do some other time. You will do the same thing to either side, and as you can see, I'm making sure I have enough seam allowance to match my boning and or giant zip tie. I like to be resourceful, so those zip ties really are handy. Anyway, you simply do the same thing you've been doing, which is run a straight stitch down, making sure to match up all your notches and all your edges as much as possible, leaving that seam allowance enough of a seam allowance to be able to fold it over, stitch it down, and create a casing. It's sewer's choice which side you flip the seam allowance to, the left or the right. It doesn't really matter. Just be consistent. And again, I'm measuring how much. Now I've grabbed this pattern piece because they have little marks on it as to how far down the boning needs to go. It doesn't need to go all the way down to your hip. So I'm going to make a note of that. I believe that I do it with a pin here at some point. And so when I'm running my stitch up, I know, there it is, there's that pin I was just talking about. When I run my stitch up, I know to stop there and run a little bit of a horizontal stitch so that my boning will stop and not move around once inside the casing. I do it right here. As you can see here, I'm making a casing for my zip tie boning. As I was going, realized that I needed a triangle notch. As the fabric is pushed into the seam when it curves inwards, making a triangle notch, and I've talked about them before, will make it so the fabric has a place to go and meet versus trying to get bunchy into a seam. It's helpful. All right, here's the super fun part about using these zip ties. The end of them are soft and curved, not soft, but curved, so it makes it really easy for them to slide into the casing that you've created. Now, to get the other end to not be a pokey nightmare, uh, you'll cut it, and now you want to cut it down a little bit from where you need it to be. And this is why all my scissors are dull, is because I don't differentiate which scissors are for what. So, you know, it's really just terrible. I use my fabric scissors for paper. I'm sure some of you are just shivering with horror at that. That's why I have like 15 pairs of scissors. Okay, so then I use a nail file to file down the edge so that it is curved and not so sharp, because your boning will poke out of its casing and or poke you, and that is no fun. And shout out to Espionage Cosmetics. That is where I get all my nail files, and I'm sure that is not the purpose that they were intended for, but I think they would think it was fun to know that that's what I am using them for. And then once you're done, you just stitch off the top so that the casing doesn't fly out, and there you go, boning from the hardware store. All right, now we're moving on to the side front, and this piece I stitch a little bit differently. It starts the same, you know, you match up your notches and you run your straight stitch down and try to keep everything all together. And from here though, because the bust curve is so curved, I don't actually put the outer stitch in. I tried a few times and the fabric just gets so bunchy that it ends up not looking very good. So I just kept it with this straight normal seam, no decorative outer seam. Make sure to clip in your triangle notches at that bust curve, because that fabric seam allowance will really need a place to fit into. Think of it as like an articulated tail on a lobster. When you push it together, they kind of come together in a way that it makes it work. Oh, I need visuals. Here I am repeating the same process with the inside, making the seam, first of all, starting with putting the pattern piece on, and then folding it to one side and creating a boning casing. And I use this same stop marker for my casing as the other piece, so I'm able to visually just put a horizontal stitch as I'm going up the inside based on the other one next to it. I'm not quite there yet in the video, but I think you'll see what I mean when I get there. But you know, I gotta put in my notches, so many notches. And this part is what I'm talking about. I can see the other horizontal stitch there, so I just place mine next to it. Makes sense. Heading around this dramatic of a curve will require a little bit of finessing. You'll want to push the seam allowances in together and make sure to pull the fabric taut so that it stitches correctly. Now, if you're newer to this, it's okay if this isn't perfect. It's tricky. And as long as you're creating a useful boning casing, which I've said that so many times now, I feel like it has to be a drinking game. If you're sewing while drinking, you have to take a drink every time I say boning casing. But it doesn't matter if it doesn't look perfect. It is on the inside. You will get better at this, and no worries as long as it's doing its intended purposes, which is holding a boning and your boobs up. So boning casing, haha, somebody has to drink. And as a side note, before I show you how to put this zip tie in, maybe don't drink and sew and operate heavy machinery, because that's a good way to get your fingers stitched, so that's no fun. But anyway, back to this. This is your zip tie boning, and I'm doing the same thing that I did before, and here in a bit I will trim it down about an inch or half an inch away from the top of the corset. And I'll use the same really, really professional technique of filing it with a nail file. And then from here, I don't believe I filmed this anymore, because it's the same process throughout the entire thing. I don't think you need to see me filing zip ties anymore after this. I think you've met your quota. But the same rules apply as you proceed forward. It's starting to come together, and you can be proud of yourself. You're halfway there. So the front should be done. Again, repeat on both sides, and now we're going to start with the back. Again, with similar to the way that we did the front, we'll start with the center back. If you're using the zipper one, there is a notch at the bottom, so you'll want to start there and then stitched down to the bottom. Don't stitch the entire thing, because we need to put a zipper in. So this is essentially where your zipper will stop. And you'll do it on this side and on the interior lining as well. Assembling the back is very similar to what we did with the front. I like to start in the center and work my way out. So here we are moving on to the middle back piece, and basically repeating the same process as the front. Match your notches, run a straight stitch down it, and I do a top stitching on all of the outer pieces for this side. Top stitching, I mean this process right here where I've opened up the seam and I'm running stitching along either side of it. And you'll just repeat this on both pieces and on both sides. Again, I'm using the markers on the pattern for the suggested stopping point for boning. And that is a sentence which out of context sounds really fun. It's a suggested stop for boning. Oh, jeez. Anyway, yes, it's suggested. So you can, once you make this the first time, you can make adjustments to it. I found later that I needed to make my the boning in the back go a little bit lower, but it works great, and it's a great place to start. So here I am just making another boning casing for those of you not sewing. It turns out I did film this one last time, but in rapid fire, it's the same as before. Clip, cut, file, stitch down. And similar as before, with the front, we are moving from the center outwards. So now I've got the side piece, and I'm doing the same as before, straight stitching down, matching all my notches, and then putting the top stitching in on the outer piece, and then I will repeat for the lining. No matter what level you are with your sewing, and some of these projects, even as a skilled sewer, can seem really intimidating. Once you see how it's all comes together, you realize it's just a lot of monotony. And I hope that you're getting something from this, whether you have everything on hand and you're ready to go, or you make this in the future, that it is watching these videos makes it less intimidating, because it really is just a series of steps you need to complete, just like anything. At this point, I want to give a nice shout out to my Patreon subscribers. Thank you for all of your support, because I'm really having a good time doing this, and I can't wait to see y'all in your bunny onesies. All right. Now we will be installing the zipper. First, you need a zipper foot, and placing the right side, or the outer side of the zipper, against the right side of the fabric. Stitch it down starting at the top, and you'll be stitching all the way into that seam allowance too, which I will show you here in just a moment. As you can see, the zipper is longer than necessary, which is a benefit in this instance because I am continuing to stitch the zipper side into the seam allowance. Flipping through, I then will stitch the other side, but I like to zip the zipper closed and then start, there we go. Yeah, now it's closed. And then I start about where I left off, and then as you stitch up, obviously you're going to meet the head of the zipper, you just need to lift up your foot and you should be able to get around it. And this will make sure that the zipper is really nicely set in there and there isn't any gapping where the zipper starts at the bottom of your garment. Since the zipper's too long, you'll want to cut it. Of course, making sure that your zipper is already zipped up. And then we'll simply just make a little tab for the end of that zipper, so mostly so that it doesn't poke. You're pretty safe since it's well past the seam that it's not going to accidentally come undone, but this can also help that too. Now we'll be adding the lining in, and you'll want to attach the lining at the zipper as well. So with the good side of the lining facing the good side of the fabric, run a stitch down that zipper. The same thing that you just did, but now with the lining on top of it. To put the lining in on the other side, you simply flip it over and match up the other sides. The good side of the lining to the good side of the fabric, and then stitch over that zipper. I have recorded and deleted 3 different versions of me trying to explain this, so please bear with me. I hope that the visual will help you. But also play with this. Grab some spare zippers you find at a thrift store and some fabric and experiment with putting zippers in, because it's really not that difficult, but it does take a little bit of practice. The next step that I take here is to stitch along the top, putting the outer fabric and the lining together. So starting at the zipper, you simply stitch along the top. And I also like to stitch lining side up so that I can see my marker points where I put the place holding stitches to hold the boning in. When you hit this point, it's exciting because things are finally starting to come together. And also you've moved away from putting top stitching in and making more boning casings. Ding, 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 for those of you not sewing. It's a drinking point. Yes, your top of the back is put together. And now I'm just going to put a top stitching in the zipper. And I'm choosing to do this from the lining side down because I chose a waxed denim and I'm worried if I try to stitch across the top of it, it will stick to my zipper foot. So that is why I've been doing this all with the wrong side of the fabric facing up. You can do it either way. When putting cover stitches in the open seam, I like to do that so I can see that the seam isn't bunching. For this particular moment here, I would prefer to do it from the top side down. Unfortunately, I wasn't sure if it was just going to be problematic. So this way seemed to work out nicely though, because the weight of this fabric, it kind of naturally folded together nicely, and it turned out that sewing it blindly was a wise choice. So it all turned out nicely. Living for those little moments when your sewing projects work out nicely, because sometimes the simplest of tasks can take hours and you're wondering what the fuck you did to make putting an arm in a jacket so complicated. But you know, you take them and you leave them. So essentially the back is done. At this point I am putting a based stitch down the side seams. And you might be wondering, well, wait, aren't you going to put a piece of boning in there? And no, I'm not going to. And here's why. I like to leave the side seams of certain garments I make open and easily accessible, because later, if you need to adjust them, whether or not it's for the final piece or for 5 years from now when you've gained or lost weight, you can very easily take it in or let it out at the seams. That is why I like to put the front piece together and the back piece together, and then at the end we stitch them all together. Okay, so what I'm doing here is essentially like what I did with the back piece before we put the top stitching in the zipper, which is just attaching the front and, attaching the lining and the front piece together at the top. And I do it from the lining side up again so that I can see my markers where the boning is. You don't want to stitch over the boning. It'll break a needle. It's not good. It's no fun. Here I'm simply trimming down some of the bulk from the seam allowance there. Very carefully cut super close to that stitch in that V, and this will help turn it out nicely. See how nice? I haven't even pressed it yet. Next, I run a straight stitch across the top here. Just close it off and hold them down together. I didn't do this on the back, but on the top I like to, because there's more of a chance that the lining might end up pulling a little bit off. So as you can see, it looks nice. And then I add my bust cups. You can do this before or later, but the bust cups are nice. They're not necessary. It's a sewer's choice. Same as the back, run a based stitch down the side seams. And what I mean by based stitch is a very loose, wide stitch. You can hand do this. Typically, based stitch refers to a wide hand stitch. This just holds it in place until we can get to a point where we can fit it onto a body, and then we'll put a proper seam in. All right, here I'm doing the same thing as I did with the sides, but going along the leg holes. And again, I have not attached the front and the back yet. This is just merely to hold it all together so we can get it to a place where we can try it on and fit it to how it needs to be fit to you. So satisfying, we're almost there. Repeat the same thing on the back. Here I am putting in my final stitch in the side seams. Prior to this, I pinned the crotch together with a safety pin, not a straight pin, and held it up to my sides enough to know that working within the allotted seam allowance and running a straight stitch up either side and attaching front and back pieces would fit me quite well. So I didn't need to make much adjustment. After I ran that straight stitch down, I simply serged it off to make it look nice, and now I'm cleaning up that top edge by flipping it under and running a very quick stitch across the top. Had the side seams done, so I safety pinned the crotch together and put it on and adjusted the crotch as necessary. You're going to want to do this because they might make the pattern a little too long or too short for you. Also at this stage, I took some pin markers and brought up the hip in the front a little bit because it was riding a little too low for me. So knowing this, I then marked that off, pinned it, and stitched it, which unfortunately I did not catch on camera. But just make sure to take that step and make sure that the hip and how high it is on the rise is what you like. Now this is a bit of a flex. I have a serger, and so this step is a little easier for me. I am just running a serge stitch or overlock stitch with elastic and pulling the elastic slightly. If you have a zigzag machine or a straight stitch machine, you can do the same thing. And conveniently, the garment is in the way, so you can't see what I'm doing here. But with the lining side up, stitch it along the leg hole and pull the elastic slightly. And this will gather the leg hole. But don't pull it so much that it's going to make it uncomfortable. You just want to give it a slight tug, and it'll help make the leg holes look nice for you. Here I am repeating on the other side. Lather, rinse, repeat. At this phase, your garment is so close to completion. You're nearly there. So give yourself a congratulatory pat on the back. And in order to close these or finish off these leg holes, there's a couple options. You can fold it over and run a zigzag or a straight stitch. I am choosing to hand stitch this down only because the fabric is so thick. I'm worried if I straight stitch it, it will ruin the elastic's elasticity. So I do this. But I'm only going to show like a few stitches because you don't need to watch me hand sew. That being said, if you are doing this technique, make sure that you're catching just the lining. That will make it so that no stitching shows on the other side. All right, we've saved the best for last, which is the crotch. It is the best. All right. You previously have marked where, how long or how much rise you need in the crotch when you did your adjustments. So now you simply stitch them together. And this is a pretty straightforward straight stitch across the bottom. If you're using a heavier weight fabric, I recommend flipping one side up and top stitching it down. Again, sewer's choice. There's many different ways to do these things. It just really depends on your preferences and what type of fabric you're using. This brings us very close to the end of our tutorial, and I hope you've learned something. I hope you didn't get lost along the way, and I hope you are well on your way to your own Playboy onesie, Playboy bunny cosplay costume look. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for joining. Happy crafting.